All right, hopefully you recognize this worksheet from chapter 1 in our book when we did our first Excel unit. In the course of doing that project, we went through and manually changed the color, the fill color of each of the rows where we had numbers. So that was a bit tedious because we had to select them all with control, each section of the worksheet individually, and that was a bit of a hassle. If you had a 500 line long worksheet, you would not want to do that. So we're going to do a slightly different method here using a couple of functions. So these functions are not covered in our book, and you won't have to know them for any exam or project or anything like that. This is for your information to give you a broader experience with Excel and some ideas about things that you can do that are a bit advanced beyond our class. But still, I think totally within your capabilities based on what you've learned so far. So what we're going to do first is learn a couple of functions that you can use. One of them is called the row function, and you can see that right now cell C22 is the active cell, and I'm going to type the row function in there. So whenever we use a function, we're doing a formula, so we have to start with equals. Now the row function is like the today function and the now function. You don't have to put anything in between the parentheses. There are no arguments. So I'm just going to type another parentheses to close that function, and I'll close the cell by pressing Control Enter. When I do that, you'll see first I've put another formula over here so that you can see what I have typed into that cell even if the cell isn't open. That's just for your information, and that formula is definitely more advanced than we cover in this class. But it will help you if you decide you want to do this on your own. You can see what the formulas are. So the row function that I typed in there just says equals row, and what it does is it goes out and gets the number of the row. You can see we're in row 22, and the row function shows a 22, so it just tells us the number of the row. Now that might not seem very important on its own, but it's actually very useful. I'll show you again with another row. This next one should not surprise you. If I type equals row and then put the row function in again, I've typed exactly the same thing in both cells. You can see by this formula over here. But the answer is now 23 because we are in row 23. So we can use the fact that the row function tells us what the number of the row is. So that's the first thing that we're going to work with. The second function we're going to work with is probably a bit different to you, but you actually know what this is. There's a function called mod, which is short for modulus. Modulus means remainder. If you take one number and divide by another number, there's usually a remainder, or the remainder might be 0. For example, if we divide 3 by 2, we get 1 with 1 left over. 3 divided by 2 is 1 with 1 left over. So the modulus is 1. I'll type that in. When you use the modulus function, you don't put in a slash for division. You just put in a comma. So we're going to take 3, type a comma, and then the divisor is the number we're dividing by. So 3 divided by 2, I close the function and press the Control Enter key, and sure enough, the remainder is 1. I'll do that again. Equals mod, and this time I'll take 6 divided by 3. If I divide 6 by 3, well, there's nothing left over. 3 goes into 6 2 times with nothing left over. So when I close this and press Control Enter, sure enough, there's a 0. So depending on what numbers you're dividing, the modulus or remainder could be any number of things. But the fact that we're going to use in this example, and I'll open this one up for editing again, if I take 6 and divide by 2 instead of by 3, the remainder is 0. Typically speaking, normally speaking, if you divide an odd number by 2, you have 1 left over. If you divide an even number by 2, you have nothing left over. So you can tell if you are in an odd numbered row or an even numbered row. A human being is smart enough that we can look at 22 and 23 and know which is odd and which is even. I'm always telling you computers are stupid. They're not as smart as us. But what they can do to help them recognize if we're in an odd or even row is if we divide the row number by 2, if the remainder is a 1, then we're in an odd numbered row. If we're in a row where the remainder is 0, then we know we're in an even numbered row. So I'm going to combine these two functions together and use that information. So if I take the mod of the row number, I'm not typing in a row number, I'm saying look and see what the row number is and then divide that by 2. Well, you can see, looking at where the cursor is, you can see that we are in row 26. So if we take row 26 and divide by 2, 26 divided by 2 goes in 13 times with nothing left over. So when I press the enter key, sure enough, there is no remainder. We are in an even numbered row. Now I'll try the same function in the next row. I could have copied it, but I chose to just type it. So we're now in row 27. We divide by 2. Well, 27 divided by 2 is 13 again, but 1 left over. So when I close that cell, sure enough, I've put the same formula in both functions, but I get a 0 if we're in an even row and a 1 if we're in an odd row. Now we can use that fact to format all of these numbers up here. If we're in an even number row, we want to do one thing. If we're in an odd number row, we want to do something else. All right, now I'm going to take one more step and then we'll be ready to do our conditional formatting, which is what we're going to use to change the color of these rows. So what I'm going to do is just copy the formula that we've already got in the previous cell, and so we can look at it. Now see, right now we just have the same formula. Because we're in an even numbered row, the result is 0. But we want to change this. So I'm going to open the cell for editing. I'm coming up and clicking in the formula bar, but you could also just double click in the cell. So I'm going to add one more thing, and this is rather like the if statements that we've used before. What we're going to say is if the mod of row divided by 2 is equal to 0, is that a true statement or a false statement? Well, right now, if I just add that equals 0 and then press the enter key, that's true. Sure enough, if you take 28 and divide by 2, and is that equal to 0? Yes, it is. So it displays 2. Now, if I copy that formula down one more time, so it's exactly the same formula as above, this is like saying if the mod of row 29, which is the row we're in now, divided by 2, is that equal to 0? No, it's not. So it makes that false. Now this statement then is either true if we're in a even number row or false if we're in an odd number row. It's either going to be true if we're in an even row or false if we're in an odd row. Now we don't want the true to use for our conditional formatting. We actually want the formula that's up here. So I've come up to highlight the formula. There's more than one way I could do this. This was just the way that felt comfortable at this moment. So I've dragged my mouse through and highlighted all that, and I pressed Control C, and now I'll press Escape to let go of that selection, and I'll highlight the cells I want. Now we only did the 2 rows in the middle there, so we didn't do the total row with this. I'm going to go to Conditional Formatting, New Rule, and we're going to use a formula to determine which cells to format. So they want the formula in here in this box. I've already put it into my clipboard by pressing Control C, so I'll press Control V, and there's the formula. Now remember that the second part when you're doing conditional formatting is to say what formatting you want. I'm going to use fill, and I want a nice light blue in the background since the rest of this is orange. Blue will contrast. So this says if we are in an even numbered row, a row where the mod of the row number when it's divided by 2 equals 0, then I want it to be blue. So I'll click OK, and I'll click elsewhere to release that selection, and you can see that that worked. Now I've only done it with 2 rows, so let's come down here and do the rest so that you can see it really does work. That formula is still in the clipboard. Things stay in the clipboard until you erase them. So now I have conditional formatting. I'm going to format those rows in the middle there with a new rule. Use a formula. The formula is in the clipboard, so I can click Control V to paste it in. This says only format the even rows. I'll click Format, and I'll stick with my nice light blue. Click OK, and you can see it's going to be regular black font on blue background. Click OK, and I'll click elsewhere, and you can see it has formatted those rows. Now this takes a little bit longer to set up, but most of that was because I was explaining it rather than it actually taking a long time. This method is helpful if you are formatting a very large worksheet and you don't want to sit there and highlight each row individually. You can actually, before you put the data in, select the range that you want to have these stripes in and fill it in directly. There are other ways to do this. I will mention there are several ways of doing this, but this builds on the basic facts that you've been learning using Excel.